For this drawing, I took inspiration from classical sculpture. I've always been fascinated by how those works manage to feel both incredibly solid and dynamic at the same time. My goal here wasn't to copy it exactly, but to reinterpret it, keeping the proportions, poses, and anatomical structure, while filtering everything through my own style. I like starting from something that already has a strong foundation, because it lets me focus more on interpretation rather than construction from scratch. It becomes more about translating than inventing. This time I started directly with a pen sketch because I really wanted to focus on line quality from the very beginning. Working in pen forces you to commit. There's no easy undo, so every mark carries a bit more intention. From the start, I try to keep the drawing light and breathable, avoiding unnecessary lines. It's very easy to overwork a piece at this stage, especially when you're unsure, but I prefer to leave space and let the drawing evolve gradually. Another thing I constantly pay attention to is the balance between black and white. Even in the early stages, I'm already thinking about how the darks will sit against the lights, trying to distribute visual weight evenly across the composition. As I move forward, the line naturally becomes more fluid and confident. This is something I notice every time I draw. There's always a short phase at the beginning where the hand feels a bit stiff, almost hesitant. But then, as I get more familiar with the shapes and the structure, that tension starts to disappear. The wrist loosens up, the strokes become more decisive, and the drawing begins to flow. At this point, I'm not just tracing forms, I'm interpreting them. I start pushing certain lines, simplifying others, and emphasizing what I feel is essential to the image. What I'm really aiming for is a line that feels increasingly spontaneous and natural, as if the hand is simply following an invisible path that's already there on the paper. Honestly, I still feel quite far from achieving that level of naturalness, but with every new drawing I could see some progress, both in my approach and in the final result. The ambition is to reach a point where I can clearly visualize the final image in my mind even before I start drawing. I'm always very curious to know what others think about the final result, because focusing so much on all the different aspects of the process can sometimes make you lose objectivity. Feel free to share your thoughts, ideas, or suggestions in the comments. I'd really find that helpful. At this stage, I'm still working mostly with line, but I'm already thinking ahead to how the tones will interact with it. I try to leave certain areas more open, almost anticipating where the light will sit later on. Some lines are intentionally kept lighter or even incomplete, so they don't compete too much once the shading comes in. It's a bit like preparing a structure that will be completed in the next phase. I'm also checking that the hierarchy of lines is clear enough, deciding which contours need to stand out and which ones can stay more subtle. This helps guide the eye before any value is added. There's a moment here where the drawing feels balanced but still unfinished, and I actually like that tension. It's a kind of transition point where the piece could almost work as a pure line drawing, but at the same time is clearly asking for more depth. And that's exactly where I start shifting my focus from line to value. In some areas, I also add a bit of hatching to reinforce the shadow zones, especially where two surfaces come into contact. It's a subtle way to suggest depth and separation even before introducing any tonal values. Once the line art is complete, I move on to adding some gray tones to give the figures more volume and a stronger sense of form. For this, I'm using a very simple setup: a watercolor marker and a water brush. I lay down some pigment and then blend it with water to create soft transitions. It's a pretty direct and flexible technique, which I like because it keeps the process spontaneous. Here I'm focusing on building different levels of light and shadow through thin layers of gray. I try not to overthink it too much. This stage is more about feeling than precision. I actually prefer a slightly rough and unpredictable result. The way water spreads the pigment creates textures, small imperfections, and accidental effects that would be very hard to replicate intentionally. Those little inconsistencies add character to the drawing and keep it from feeling too rigid or over-controlled. For me, that's an important part of keeping the piece alive. As I keep adding tones, I'm also checking that the overall balance still works, that no area becomes too heavy or too empty compared to the rest. It's a constant adjustment between adding and holding back. Sometimes it's more about what you choose not to do than what you actually add. At this stage, I'm mostly refining and reinforcing what's already there, rather than introducing new elements. Small adjustments can make a big difference, darkening a shadow, softening an edge, or leaving a highlight untouched. It's all about subtle control without losing the freshness of the earlier steps. And that's pretty much it for this piece. The whole process is fairly simple in terms of tools, but it really comes down to observation, control, and letting go at the right moments. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you think in the comments. I'm always curious to hear feedback.